Fire Emblem is a series where your team is generally pretty malleable. Usually you recruit a few characters in the early chapters, and suddenly you have more units than you have deployment slots, and from that point forward, you have to make a decision on who comes with you and who doesn't to each chapter, which can have a pretty big impact on how a playthrough goes. The way that you're able to customize your army is part of how the player expresses themselves and part of why Fire Emblem games are so replayable to me. And this design choice also influences how Fire Emblem designs its challenges. They have to be designed to account for whatever units the player might bring, and just as importantly, any unit they might not bring. You don't want a player to lose a chapter because they didn't bring a unit they needed in order to beat a map, or worse, you don't want someone to softlock because a required unit died. So Fire Emblem maps are designed to accommodate a player benching and deploying whoever they want. There's always at least one exception to this though, and that's each game's lord. For the purposes of this discussion, I'll be defining a lord as any character who causes a game over upon their death, and who you are forced to deploy on most maps or all maps in a game. I'm aware that this would not include certain characters like Robin or Lucina, who I'm fine with calling lords generally, they just fall outside the scope of what I want to talk about today. Lords are interesting because they are the exception to the rule I just established. In a series partially defined by characters being able to die for good, and players being able to choose their army, lords are the opposite. Ever-present and game-ending on death. So while developers can't assume much about what a player's team will look like at any point in the game, they can always assume that the lord is both alive and deployed. With that in mind, lords have a slightly different role in Fire Emblem games compared to other units, both because they are always around and because they often have additional responsibilities such as seizing thrones or recruiting a lot of units. With that in mind, I thought it would be fun to look at the different ways Fire Emblem has designed lords and talk about their pros and cons and which ones I like best. To start with, I think there are two very important factors that impact how a lord feels to use, and that's how important they are to objectives, which would account for how many thrones they have to seize, how many units they have to recruit, and how many side objectives they have to do. And second, how much utility they offer, and that one's pretty straightforward. It's basically just how much stuff do they do that helps you win maps. So that includes tasks that non-lord units can perform too, like combat, staff utility, or supporting other units. This gives us four pretty neat categories that I've taken the liberty of naming. A lord with lots of objectives they need to complete but low utility is an escort quest. A lord with lots of objectives they need to complete and high utility is a juggernaut. A lord with few objectives they need to complete and high utility is just a normal unit with a force deployment slot. And a lord with a few objectives they need to complete and low utility is just an unfortunate unit. Of course, most lords fall somewhere in between the extremes of these categories, and I'm oversimplifying a lot. There are more to lords than just those two factors, and some lords can even be in one of those categories for part of the game, but not for the whole game. For example, Roy has important early game contributions, especially with his rapier, before eventually falling into more of an escort quest role in the mid-game. Still, by looking at a lord's importance to objectives and on-map utility, you can get a pretty good idea for how that lord is going to impact how their game plays. So let's look at a few lords that are all designed pretty differently and fall into different places in this categorization. I'm not going to go through every lord in the series here, but I want to talk about a handful that I think exhibit different ways you can design a lord. Let's start with FE1 Marth. I did a whole video about this unit, but to summarize it, it wouldn't be exaggerating to say that FE1 is all about Marth. Every map is a siege map, villages have to be visited by Marth, lots of characters are recruited by Marth, and Marth even gets a special weapon that makes him the best candidate for fighting the final boss. And enemy AI loves ignoring your units and attacking Marth as though he's a pellet and they are hungry, hungry hippos. Marth has so much to do in FE1 that I didn't even mention that he also has the ability to open chests, because I find Marth is so busy doing other stuff that only he can do that he doesn't have time to go get chests, and I deploy thieves to do that instead. So, Marth has very high importance to objectives, the highest in the series. But he's also pretty strong. His growths are comparable to other strong units like Cain and Abel, his bases are acceptable, and because enemies love attacking him, he gains a lot of experience practically by accident. Being essential to objectives also makes him a compelling target for stat boosters, because if Marth has to be everywhere and enemies love to attack him, it makes sense to get Marth as strong as possible, especially since his stats are already solid. So a couple boosts gets him to nigh invincible territory because stat boosters are disgusting in FE1, so I would categorize FE1 Marth as a juggernaut. Even though it takes him a few chapters to really get cooking, because he has to go everywhere, enemies want to hit him, and it's easy to get him one-rounding. In a casual playthrough, you either have to hold Marth back if you don't want him to eventually pop off, or kill everything ahead of him with your horses, which doesn't even save you any time because you're still going to have to walk Marth to the objective to complete it anyway. This exemplifies why I don't love lords that fall into the extreme of being very important and very powerful. I don't like it when a force-deployed unit is the best answer to too many problems in a game because the other units start to feel kind of superfluous. There's not much power fantasy in training Barst when we know Marth is sitting right behind him and could be doing the same jobs but better. Of course, you can just hold Marth back and not let him fight enemies and become powerful, but I don't like this for two reasons. One, it's tedious because, again, Marth has to go to all of the objectives and enemies prefer attacking him to other units. And two, I have no self-control. Imagine we're at a grocery store and Marth is the junk food that I'm trying to avoid. Maybe I can resist using Marth if I leave him at the store, but it's harder if he's living in my pantry. In FE1, Marth is always right at the front of your pantry, begging to be used. Beyond grocery store analogies, if you elect just to not use Marth, you're even still punished with a much harder final boss fight, since only Marth can wield the falchion, which makes defeating Medius a lot easier. I also don't think that being a juggernaut fits Marth's character super well. Part of his arc is becoming a great leader. His journey is him building an army to support him and inspiring those around him. There's a little bit of personal growth there too, but I've never really felt that Marth's story is about his combat acumen. So there's some dissonance when in gameplay he's often single-handedly dominating entire armies. Sorry Astrum, turns out you're not the strongest man in Arcanea, it's been Marth the whole time. A couple other lords that fall into this juggernaut category like Marth are FE4's Sigurd and Seliph. Just like Marth, these units are over-centralizing to the point that for any given challenge the game throws at me, my first thought is, why not just use my lord? They are also key to objectives since every castle has to be seized, and doing so can even remove enemies from the map. Sigurd is definitely the strongest combat-wise of this group. Unlike Marth, Sigurd is immediately dominant, whereas Marth takes a little training and possibly some stat boosters. But I use Marth as the example here because having to visit villages is unique to him, plus he's the first ever lord. Of course, even non-lord units that are super combat dominant can create this juggernauting problem, but at least they're easier to ignore if you choose to because they can usually be benched or at least don't have to be at every objective. Next up, we're going to look at one of my favorite lords, Alear. Alear has fairly low importance to objectives because Engage is mostly kill boss maps. With the exception of Chapter 22, you could beat Engage while doing almost nothing with Alear. Alear also has solid utility. Being around in the early game means they're a viable option for Mercurius or Great Sacrifice grinding if you want them to do good combat, or they can fill a support role by supporting everyone, buffing allies with Divinely Inspiring, and either using Dragon-type ring bonuses, or reclassing into a staff class. So Alear falls into my just a good unit with a force deploy slot, but that's not such a bad thing. I like Alear because the developers did enough to make them feel unique through their dragon typing and support options, and they can do solid combat if you build them that way, but they aren't over-centralizing in the same way a unit like Sigurd or FE1 Marth are. They don't have to be at every objective, so if you do a boss rush or send a squad to a side objective like a village, Alear doesn't have to be there. Despite not being essential to objectives, Alear still feels useful because there's always something good for them to be doing, even if they aren't your best option to do everything. Just like any other typical unit, but with a little extra spice in the form of a force deploy slot that ensures Alear is always around, and some unique traits like the dragon typing and supporting everyone that ensures Alear has some unique use cases. This is a pretty simple type of lord, pretty straightforward, and I think it's a good framework for a fun main character, especially in games with reclassing. A lord that can fill in for a lot of roles is a great way to give players a unit they can experiment with while being unlikely to mess them up with a poor build, but their lack of objective importance and lower power level compared to someone like Sigurd ensure that the rest of your army still has a chance to shine. I particularly like this sort of lord when a lot of their power is tied up in supportive effects like Alear's personal skill. This way, Alear is more likely to help your other units rather than overshadow them. Though it's totally fine for a lord's power to come from good combat too, just so long as they aren't the best at everything. A unit like Ike in Radiant Dawn has great combat, but being footlocked and maps often not being a single objective that Ike has to be at, ensures that there are always good reasons for other units to be putting in work. Another great example of a solid lord with low importance to objectives is Alm in Gaiden and SOV. Almost all the maps are route maps, so you could have Alm do almost nothing, but his solid combat and promotion make him compelling to use for most players. Alm is also a great example for showing that a lord doesn't have to be super important to feel fun to use. Alm barely has to do anything in his games, but most people enjoy using him because he's the main character, has good combat, and a unique class. And the way that promotions work in SOV, even if you choose not to use Alm in the early game, being boosted to his class minimums when he promotes ensures that you always have a usable unit. Basically, as long as your main character is liked by the player, decent to good utility in combat and a force deploy slot is enough that they will be well used by the player base. There are lots of lords with good combat or non-combat utility, but there are also many lords on the weaker side. This doesn't mean they're useless. Like any other unit, these lords can be made strong with investment, and they may even have niches in certain playstyles. But for most players, I think these lords I'm about to talk about feel a little underwhelming in terms of utility. But I think you can have low utility lords that still lead to compelling gameplay. This type of lord is what I call an escort quest. High objective importance, low utility. I talked earlier about how strong FE1 Marth was, and he's good in FE3 and 12 as well. However, in Shadow Dragon, Marth is not overly impressive. He can do some combat with a forged rapier, and he's important in the first handful of chapters, which are sort of an all-hands-on-deck situation in harder difficulties where you really want everyone to pitch in. But most players will probably find themselves disappointed with his performance later. In fact, he even has a little less utility than most other units because he can't reclass, he can't promote, and his levels cap at 30 to compensate, but that's still 10 less than other units could potentially get. Plus, not only do you not need him to kill Medius anymore, but on higher difficulties he's not even particularly good at that job. Bummer. So, Shadow Dragon Marth doesn't have the same power previous versions of the character do, but he's still about as important to objectives. He still needs to grab villages, seize every map, and recruit some units. For that reason, he's a great example of an escort quest lord. Unlike FE1 Marth, who could just wreck every objective on his own after a brief training arc, Shadow Dragon Marth wants to bring a buddy along or have a squad run ahead of him and clear the way when he goes to do objectives. Marth still does contribute a bit here beyond just grabbing objectives. Occasional effective damage that can be forged in the form of rapier isn't bad, and he also supports a large percentage of the cast, way more than any other unit. So he's never totally dead weight, but Marth isn't going to be the star of the show in Shadow Dragon. I actually prefer Shadow Dragon's version of Marth to FE1's version of Marth, because this version of Marth encourages you to use more of your army to help Marth out, whereas in FE1, Marth is so good that it's really easy to just have him take on objectives without using other units in your army. This type of lord can be fun. Having to escort a unit to different objectives is an interesting challenge in its own right, and you can choose to train the lord to make those challenges easier if you want. I think with this sort of lord, or any lord with high objective importance though, it is essential to design maps such that the act of getting your lord to side objectives or seize points is actually interesting. A bad example of this is Battle of Altea in FE1 and its various remakes. Regardless of which version of the map you're playing, Marth needs to go all the way to the top left of the map to recruit Samson or Aaron from the villages, then all the way to the right side of the map to grab Zane. You can reverse the order of those two if you want. Either way, then you have to make the trek all the way to the seize point in the center of the map. No matter how you slice it, this just isn't super interesting, and Marth is going to spend a fair amount of time just walking around unthreatened. Not exactly the most riveting gameplay, especially if you either didn't give Marth the boots, or didn't save a warp. This would be a little less of an issue in games with pair-up or rescue that would allow you to use flyers to move Marth around, but no such luck in the Arcanea games. A map that does Lord important side objectives better is Black Knight Camus in the same games. On this map, Marth needs to visit a village on the opposite side of the map from the boss to grab a Hamurn staff, and in FE3 recruit Est. If your Marth isn't super cracked, which he might be in FE1 or 3, you're going to need to send a buddy with him to clear out the paladins, while the rest of your group can go up and clear the way to Camus. From there, Marth can gun it to the throne in a few turns if he has the boots and your army is done clearing the way. Otherwise, he can walk around while dealing with reinforcements that will ensure there aren't many turns where Marth is just walking and doing nothing. So the map encourages you to split into 2 groups, and both of those groups have mostly active turns and not a ton of downtime. Cool. A+ map. Escort quest lords are one of the trickier types to design because maps have to be set up to make them interesting, and if you fail to make them interesting, they can either be boring or very frustrating. It's boring if your lord is just walking to a throne unimpeded after your units cleared the area out. That's no fun. But it can be frustrating if there are too many things that can randomly snipe your weak lord and make you reset the map. I think that's why a lot of people didn't like someone like Nil in Engage's Fell Xenologue. But I also think that these types of escort quests can present some unique challenges that are difficult to get without a mission-critical unit to protect. Fell Xenologue 1, I thought, did a great job of this, where it's kind of fun figuring out how to protect Nil from all of these enemies, but it doesn't feel too overwhelming to do so. That game also benefits from having emblem rings, which you can give to Nil to ensure that he doesn't feel like completely dead weight as you're trying to complete the map. This sort of design can be great for lords where combat isn't central to who they are. Marth's story isn't really one of him being a super strong fighter, it's of him building and inspiring an army, so he works well as an escort quest that provides a lot of support bonuses. Similarly, Roy isn't really meant to be a powerhouse in the story. Leading his army is very much a role he was thrust into, so him being more of an escort quest in the mid-game ties into the story nicely. Alright, we've talked about lords that are important to objectives and lords that have good utility. And lastly, we're going to talk about units that don't excel at either. I don't think this kind of lord is ideal, so it's fortunate that Fire Emblem really hasn't given us one that is extremely weak in both of these traits. The two that come closest for me are FE7 Eliwood in his own mode and FE8 Erica. I'll be focusing on Eliwood because Erica is my all-time favorite FE character, so if I'm going to talk about why I think a unit isn't very good, I would rather talk about Eliwood. FE7 has loads of non-siege objectives, including defense maps, route maps, kill boss maps, and survive maps. In all of these maps, Eliwood doesn't have to do anything. And in fact, you're usually better off letting other units take the helm because Eliwood's stats do not impress in a world where you've got Marcus and Oswin almost at the jump, and where a late promotion keeps him from getting a horse, lance access, and promotion bonuses until near the end of the game. His bases also don't impress, comparing non-favorably to units with better properties than him at join, like Lowen, and being stuck in his base class for most of the game prevents his growths from carrying him out of his rut, even if they aren't too bad on paper. The result is that it's very easy for Eliwood to become an afterthought, and even if you do use him, you rarely feel rewarded for the investment. Unlike other categories of Lord, I do not see a ton of value in this sort of unit design. It can be sort of fun to try to find little things for Eliwood to do so that you're generating some value out of his free deployment slot, but his existence and role does not create many interesting challenges. It also rarely creates moments of excitement, which I think is the reason why FE games rarely include lords that are both of low utility and limited importance to objectives. Sadly, Erica from FE8 is in a similar boat, although her game being easier in general and having the Tower of Valmy means that if you want to use her, I find it a lot easier to get Erica to where she can kill a bunch of enemies, and her late game PRF Sieglinde at least lets her kill monsters in a single round, unlike Eliwood who doesn't get to benefit from Durandal for very long, and also it's not even that good. So this is a really simple type of lord and one I do not like very much. I think lords should be good at something, whether that be getting objectives or providing decent on-map utility. I also mentioned earlier that it's possible for a lord's role to change over the course of the game, and I think a great example of this is Leaf. Leaf is likely to be one of your better combat units in the challenging Manster arc early in Thracia 776. You don't have any of your pre-promotes with you, and Leaf is a potential candidate for the early stat boosters, plus he's got a nice PRF in the light brand. But eventually you get more strong units that eclipse him, allies start to promote while Leaf has to wait for a story-based promotion that isn't even that good, and at this point Leaf becomes a lot closer to an escort quest type of lord, though even later in the game he can still provide some utility by providing supports to a lot of units or using scrolls to boost his combat stats if you want him to be good at combat. He can also do tasks that don't require great combat, like fighting weaker red units while other units take on more dangerous foes or grabbing villages. Basically, he is a filler unit, but he's always deployed so you can find things for him to do. And he doesn't have to worry about stamina, which is also nice in FE5. Leaf is one of my absolute favorite lords in the series, and this shift in role throughout the game is a big part of it. Leaf has this whole arc where he's overshadowed by the pre-promotes at the beginning of the game that are mentoring him. then he gets a moment to shine in the Manster arc, and then he starts to fade into the back to let the other units be your biggest players. It's a great fit for his narrative arc as well. Leaf starts the game as sort of a scrappy youth traveling with the Freeblades, but by the end of the game, Leaf's combat prowess isn't really what defines him. It's the leadership that he's learned from his mentors and experiences. And so it follows that by the end of the game, he's more mechanically defined by his literal leadership stars and supports rather than being good in combat. Of course, it is Thracia, so if you want him to be great at combat, you can always just stack scrolls on him. So those are a few ways that Fire Emblem has designed lords, and a handful of lords that I think are pretty interesting. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video, and if you've got a favorite lord design, I would love to hear about it in the comments, or if you want to chat about it more, consider checking out the community Discord linked in the video description. And if you liked the video, be sure to hit the like or subscribe button so that you never miss an upload. And as always, a big thank you to my geckos on Patreon, and a shout out to my skinks, Morgwolf, Wingman, Upscale Furry Trash, Lonely Voxel, Cosplay Sylveon, Aikipoo, Lucy Sev, Emma, Stars to Art, The Noodle Doodler, Muted Miami, Aaron Geddon, Doopy, and Red Mage Morgan. I really appreciate your support, and I hope everyone watching has a lovely week.